Okay, so far in commissioning my Rover V8 engine, I've been running the water pump at full system voltage, and the purpose of today's video is to run through the commissioning of the controller. This is an older version of the controller that I'm using here that I bought a couple of years ago. It's been superseded by more modern ones, but basically I can't really justify the cost of changing to the new ones. So, and there's some things that I want to do to improve the function of this particular unit. First of all, how does it work? If I can just get over to the instruction book. So you can hopefully see on the left hand side the controller puts out no voltage at all. Then it introduces pulses, 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off, as the temperature runs up, and then it runs between 5 volts output and the full system voltage according to the temperature as the system warms up. Now, I'm not comfortable with the idea of no water circulating at all. We'll perhaps investigate that as we go along, and so I'm cutting into the system loom to be able to do some other tricks just to get the controller to do what I want it to do. In addition, the controller continues to run once the system once ignition's turned off. The controller continues to run for either 2 minutes or until the temperature is below the set point on the controller. You can see the range of set points is down the bottom here. And so there's 1 or 2 things that I want to play with there as well. Just running through the wiring then, coming out of the system. There's a red and black cable that goes to the sensor that's already plugged into the engine. This red cable is the main power supply into the unit. This is always on. Then we have a brown earth cable over here. And so that's just bog standard system earth. For the pump itself, there are a blue cable and a black cable. I've cut into that already. This provides the output from the controller to the pump. I'm cutting into that partly because I want to measure the voltage that the controller is putting out, but also because when the engine's starting from cold, then actually I want to be running the pump, so more of that later. Then there's the green cable which goes to the ignition source, and this appears to be used purely to detect whether the engine is running or not. And finally there's a diagnostic LED light that gives information about what's going on with the controller by way of errors and anything of that sort. So we'll begin. So I'm all wired up for the first go at this. The important wires here are the blue and black cable that supply power from the controller to the pump, and we'll see where they go. Also the green ignition sensing switch and cables to the red warning light over here. This is my breadboard system here in which I'm working the whole thing up. I've got the lamp, the warning lamp from the controller over here. I'm using, they're over here, but just to point out, I'm using a switching relay here so that the output on this terminal is actually selecting between either of these 2 inputs down here, and of course that's controlled on a relay from the 2 pins acrosswise. And these are my 2 relays down here, if you can see through the sea of wires. and what I'm doing is to switch between either full system voltage or the voltage being generated by the controller, and that's coming from an adjustable, all too dark in here, but I've got an adjustable, there we are, adjustable switch in here so that I can change the temperature at which that switches in for my test, and that controls whether it's going from, let's call it manual mode, full system voltage, or what's coming out of the controller. Well, I've also got a little digital voltmeter in here so that I can monitor what the controller is doing. First off then, let me just switch the, turn the thermostat to a position where it's actually very cold, and the controller is lighting up and it says it's ready to go. Now I want to run my temperature at 80 degrees centigrade. Okay, so now I'm going to scroll forward and I'm going to, you can see I can scroll through whatever temperature I want. I want 80. And now I press and hold for 1-2 seconds, and now it's flashing rapidly. Let go of that. There we go, and when I press it once, then it tells me it's 80 and back to its standard setting. So let's get started and see if it works. Okay, so it's just lit up. 75 is flashing, indicating it's not there yet. I'm reading 80 on my gauge, so there's clearly a inconsistency there. So we've got to 75. When that gets up to 80, then I'm going to set the cooling fans to come on when 80 lights up solid. There it is now, a little bit too early. So I just tweak that. Okay, so with the controller output running at full voltage and the fan activated, it was showing before I stopped the engine a steady 80 LED. It's just flipped down to that in the time it's taken to start the video camera and pull out the fuses. That was holding on about the 1 on the 175 over here, so 175 should be about 80. So there's clearly a discrepancy between my gauge and the controller. I guess I'm inclined to believe the controller rather than the gauge, which is about 65 years old. So I'm just letting I've just pulled the fuses out of the ignition and the fuel pump, just letting the system cool down gracefully. And I guess that concludes my first pass through, and I think we're looking pretty good. So a lot of lessons learned on how to implement and use the controller and set it up. I left the car overnight so I can start from cold. I've made a few changes on my breadboard system here that I'll run through, and then we'll start the engine and complete the fine tuning as I want it for really just tick over setting up the carbs here in the workshop it'll probably need a little bit more attention when the car is at a more advanced state and I can actually take it out and drive it about. So first of all, I'll just run through the changes that I've made. Here's what I've got now on my breadboard system. I've put in this potentiometer. I'm just using it as a variable resistance. I think it's actually from a disused Chinese nuclear power station, but that's a 5 ohm unit, and I can just use that to vary the voltage to the pump when I'm running in the warm-up mode before it switches over onto the control unit. I was getting some issues with my little digital voltmeter. Yesterday it wasn't happy to run below 10 volts, so I put a good old-fashioned analog voltmeter in here, and what we'll do now is just to switch on the ignition. And now with the setting on my variable resistor, I've got 0 resistance nominally on there, and I'm just going to tweak this around and set the voltage. So this is the voltage for the warm-up mode of the engine. It's going to take longer to warm up than the Davies Craig controller would have it doing, but I'm happy to sacrifice that in terms of a more gradual and progressive warm-up. And so having set that to a nominal 5 volts, then we'll start the engine and warm the thing up. Over on the temperature gauge here, for predictability, while I'm largely for running the engine to set up the carbs, I'm going to switch in control of the Davies Craig unit when the temperature needle hits the 5 of 175, so that I can see easily that it's about to switch in, or how far off switch to auto mode it's going to be. And the first thing that I'm going to do before starting the engine is to reset the controller to 75 degrees rather than 80. So we'll do that now. I'm going to set my temperature to 75 for my first setup, just to see how that goes. So if I press the set button, that tells me it's on 75. Let me just march its way through. Gets to 75, release, and hold for 2 seconds. Rapid flash, it's set. That just gives me a margin just to see how well it controls. Okay, that's all done, so let's start the engine now and see if we can make it sing and dance. Engine's cold, oil pressure's good, running at 6 volts on the pump. Water circulating in the radiator. Back again when she's warmed up. Okay, temperature's coming up now. Just approaching the 5 on my 175 on my gauge. So now just feeling for the control on my temperature switch. See over here, actually we're just below 5 volts now. I'll maybe tweak that. But here we are. So it's just coming up to 5. And now I'm going to adjust the temperature control on my switch. There it is. So now it lighting up, initializing. It's below 75 now. We can see because the PWR switch is flashing, that means it's in pulsing mode. See on my voltmeter we're nominal 5 volts for 5 seconds, back to 0 for 5 seconds. And actually I want the controller to come in beyond the pulsing mode, so I'm just going to take my switch back up again so that we're back on into manual mode. I'm going to carry on doing this until I'm past the pulsing mode. So on my temperature gauge I'm just going to try again when the needle is sitting between 7 and 5. Again, that's just to give me a rule of thumb as to when the controller is going to cut in when I'm running the vehicle. So here we go, it's just come in. Right, so now that is running constantly, but because, as we can see on the PWR LED, the 75 is flashing, showing that the controller believes that we're below 75. You can see the volts meter is right, so it's now creeping up. So what I'm going to end up with, I'll come back tomorrow and run this from cold again. But what I want to do is to bypass the pulsing mode on the controller and have it come in when it's on the linear part of the behaviour as the engine warms up. So now we can see that's creeping up. 12 volts is what it says at the moment. That's probably all it's going to give me. We're slightly beyond 12 there. I've got a constant 75 over here. Now, without the cooling fan, the heating of the engine is going to continue. And what I'm going to do is when that LED, when the 80 LED lights up, then I'm going to switch the cooling fan on at that point. Try and steady that a bit. Should get there any moment. So that's 80. Switching the cooling fan on. We're on about 1 on the temperature gauge of the 175 there. So that gives me a nice predictable setup. That gives me a nice predictable setup for how the engine is, the cooling system is going to run as I go forward in my next step in setting up the carbs. And we can see that the pump is still running because the temperature switch is above, but it will, as it cools down, then that will switch off. So I've pulled the fuses on the ignition and the fuel pump so that I can have the cooling fans running while the engine's cooling down, just to bring the temperature down below that level. And in the final implementation of this, I will arrange the cooling fan to behave in this way when the engine's turned off. And I guess that's about all we can say at this stage. Next steps in my project are, now that I've got a reliable working cooling system, turn my attention back to setting up the carbs. Over and out until the next video.